So I just nice to have you back again on the Deadline Report with Ben Virgin Fresh FM investigates. Just had a little bit of a technical issue there, so I had to put on a song and take care of that little emergency. So we were talking beforehand about the protests, or the police, and the way the protest took place. Now, what I was just going to recap that was that the Maori government got involved in negotiations. The negotiations would have a hui on the March the 5th and the 6th, and that was signed off by the police at approximately about, give or take, about 10, between 10 p.m. and 11 p.m. the night before the police actually went in. That has never been addressed by anybody that I'm aware of, and nobody's questioned the authenticity of the document. No one said, no, that's not true, because the Maori government put out a letter saying that. No one's challenged them on that, but that's a significant issue. Where is everybody in the media? No, because it doesn't fit the narrative. So that becomes misinformation, and that's really the problem. Is that so much of that word misinformation, disinformation that the MSM rolls out is they're guilty of it themselves. So it's actually losing any meaning. So again, it's one more thing that undefines why it is that basically mainstream media is crumbling. It's people don't have faith in it anymore, and the institutions themselves and the journalists that work for it don't get it because they don't understand what lines that they're crossing. Now, during the protests, the other thing that occurred was that what we saw was that this thing I said to you about the protests being reported as being violent, and there was all these other things that there was sexual abuse issues, and there were, basically there was an attempt to paint the protesters' characters as being dysfunctional and just not to be taken seriously. In contrast, as somebody that was there seeing this happen firsthand, what I saw was, number one, a media that never tried to talk to anybody and get their actual stories. They already knew their stories, so they didn't need to talk to the people and get their stories because they were going to tell everybody out there what every single protester thought and why they were there, and all lump them together as one group. That this is what the kind of people are. The protesters are. My experience was that when you actually dealt with protesters, that there was a very diverse bunch of people there. They were all there for many, many, many reasons, and a lot of those reasons were actually very, very genuine reasons. And I think a lot of Kiwis would have been moved if they'd had a chance to actually be these stories had been heard. They unfortunately the protesters were never given that opportunity. Number two, I'm trying to remember the journalist, the one exception to the rule. My brain goes blank. But one of the Radio New Zealand reporters actually did turn around and make up the point that Trevor Mullard had turned around and said to the parliamentary press that any of them seen engaging in any of the protesters, speaking to them directly, would face consequences. Now, he actually also went down and had a chat to the protesters and found actually that they didn't have three heads and they weren't breathing fire out their bottoms. Um, but then again, we never really actually heard from him do any further follow up reports on that, and nobody ever actually did any follow up report on that incredible statement that the Speaker of the House is now turning around and telling journalists what they can and what they can't report. And stop and think about that very, very, very seriously. Now, at the same time in Parliament, imagine that as you're doing that, imagine the beehive, and imagine next to it there is the Ukrainian flag flying in response to the situation that the people in the Ukraine are facing. And yet you have a government that won't actually talk to the protesters. You have a police force that, instead of getting to second things, are playing, funny bugger tricks. So basically, we're heading the beginning steps down the road there. And you have a media that can't work out why having a government official say that there will be consequences uh, is a really terrible thing, and that guy Mullard should be being flamed alive for being said that, but nobody said a thing. And of course, this is not unusual. During the Christchurch shooting, again, there was the event of the trial before the shooter declared himself guilty. So that never happened. But the government was starting to tell us which journalists could and could not and cannot cover that story, and lay down a whole list of conditions, which the media just rolled over and accepted. Said, yeah, sure, we don't mind that the biggest terrorist event in the coup, which might also have a question of intelligence failures or addressing issues like, why is Brenton Tarrant wearing a Azov battalion from the Ukraine war, which no one was reporting back then, or looking about what was going on and what that was all about. It was only now that everyone's suddenly become an instant expert. We accepted. We just rolled over when we went and did that. And the same thing actually happened here in terms of the protest. There was no actual challenging of the government narrative, and even when the government made it very clear that they would punish those who did in the system, they still managed to say, no, we'll let that one slide. We'll just pretend that didn't actually happen. And now you're reading an article in the Christchurch Press saying how loss of trust is fed our divisions, and what can we do to bring it back? Well, having maybe a media that actually doesn't let the Speaker of the House turn around and decide who and who can't be spoken to would be a good place to start. Just putting that out there. Again, when I went up there, I turned around and I thought it would be quite good actually to go to some of these press reviews and actually again, I didn't actually plan to actually ask any questions, but I just wanted to see how they ran and confirm what I thought was going on in terms of the media and how those press releases were basically the case of allowing the government to control a narrative by actually having access to who could speak to the government and who couldn't. So I applied for media representation in the press gallery. I've run my newspaper for 20 years, the Deadline newspaper for 20 years. I've worked and written for papers like I've written for papers like the Nelson Mail, the Christchurch Press. I've written for overseas organisations. I've had 4 books published, 2 of which have been bestsellers. So I think I've got a pretty good worker body to show that I am a working, functioning journalist who has managed to maintain a set of standards for 40 years of his career. No response when I ask for accreditation, because who do I have to ask? The Speaker of the House. So the Speaker of the House now actually gets to decide who can actually turn around and ask questions of the government. The irony of what I'm saying this, of course, is that as I'm reading that newspaper, the same newspaper, in the middle of it is a centrefold. Or maybe it's different. No, different newspaper. Same newspaper, different dates. But there's a centrefold in it. Big flashy flash front page there of Tova O'Brien. Now, for those who didn't pick up beforehand, there has been a number of comedy sketches done now where Jacinda Ardern gets up and addresses the press, and all the questions go to Tova O'Brien because she is known that she's not going to ask any difficult questions of the Prime Minister. And here we have the front page. That's the person that gets promoted because she's playing the game, so she gets the front page of the Inside Sunday newspaper clip. That's maybe having a system where we weren't so blatantly actually rewarding those who maintain the status quo would be another reason that maybe the public would actually start trusting the media again if they weren't so busy being lapdogs and licking it. It's just putting it out there. As I say. In Wellington, of course, the other thing that we determined was there would be reports saying things that start off with Chris Luxon talking about the protesters being the great unwashed, which nobody again thought that was really that inappropriate or not way how public media or politicians should speak about the public. No worries there, and they would turn around and they would run this idea that the protesters didn't know what they wanted and they all rebel and all either Christian lunatics. And the story there was that started off unwashed, and then it began that the protesters were trying to flush stuff into the water. They never actually sourced that provide you. And it was the same thing when they turned around and said things were actually thrown at the police or some claim or children were abused. There was never a requirement, or the media didn't feel that it had to front up with some form of evidence of those particular allegations. It was just accepted that because the protesters are the great unwashed, you can say whatever you like about them, and that's okay. That's an acceptable form of media. You're not required to actually offer up any form of documented proof to your claims. We're not required to have a journalist standard here. Again, they're asking what they can do to win our trust back. How about actually have some journalist standards that are actually maintained whoever or whatever's actually happening, that these you let the methodology fill the story so that it tells the accuracy, as opposed to creating this sort of it would continue. The next thing that would happen was that they turn around and they would report that the protesters had connected up the toilets to the water, which was flushed into the ground. So gone from there was they're pooping the water to now they're actually yes, they've confirmed it's the protesters and they're doing it from this toilet here. Except for the fact was that wasn't what had happened. The protesters, who of course included people that were tradies, because they were literally everyday people, had managed to work out with the tradies which was the sewage lines and which were the waste, and made sure that they connected up to the sewage. Now, that would later be corrected in later stories, two-thirds of the way down the bottom of the article, but in the original articles which remained online, those errors were never actually corrected. So again, this was the misconception of people I was engaging people down in Dunedin from the Labour Green scene that was so sure of they would fit to the fit narrative of the media, that they would repeat the stuff and accept it as being the living proof and truth, so that even when you were able to turn around and show them photos, they wouldn't actually believe it. And the only reason why, in actual fact, that the mainstream media turned around and corrected the story about the protesters actually flushing poop into the waterways was because people like me and the other 1,000, they had 60,000 meals through those kitchens. They only reported that all those people came with phones, and they all reported and took documents, and they're all citizens journalists, and they all turned around and sent back, so that when people, the media, were reporting their stories, and then people were back home were actually looking at what their friends were experiencing and noticing that both the two things weren't quite matching up, that was another blow to the mainstream media. And of course, because of the fact that they can't work out that they actually have done these things and won't own their own failures, they still sitting there scratching their heads going, I don't understand why people don't trust us anymore. I do. So my experience in Wellington, when wrapping up in the last 3 minutes, was that every day I would witness events happen firsthand, and I would either experience a lack of actual media there to actually record or document these, even though this was the most significant event happening in our country and was clearly the number of people that were actually at Wellington clearly blew the narrative that only a few people, as I said, when I watched Kaikoura in the first few days, it started with 200 people. I thought, oh, gee, a lot more people turned up than I thought it would do. And by the end of the day, it was actually over 1,000 cars with 4 or 5, between 3,000 to 5,000 protesters on that first day. Totally made it clear that actually what we've been told, been reading in the media about the scale of people actually upset, not actually happy with the government or the mandate controls, was actually a lot greater than that. And of course, the final thing I also mentioned was the fact that, of course, along the way, at the very beginning, we may have forgotten, because this, again, our media doesn't actually ever have any sense of history. It doesn't go back and report on what it said, that a week ago or 6 months or 10 years ago. Everything happens like out of the new, and any mistakes are just forgotten and brushed over. But one of the big areas, of course, at the beginning of the COVID was we were told that even in the best case scenario, that New Zealand could experience 10,000 deaths. Well, 10,000 deaths didn't occur, which basically means that the epidemiology numbers, which calculate the threat risk response, were wrong, which is what people of the so-called great unwashed have been saying from the beginning. So no, you're not only is it wrong, but more importantly, because you've got it wrong, what you're going to do is you're going to prevent surgeries taking place. So we now know that there are at least 10,000 people that have gone from being treatable cases of cancer to untreatable. So yes, they were kind of right in a way. 10,000 people have died, but they died because of the fact that the system got shut down based on bad experts, which were able to regurgitate the stuff through the government that is accepted by a increasingly corporate or government-funded or owned press, with just blind acceptance. And any attempt to self-critique or critique those views is increasingly treated as some form of political pariah. We're in a really, really, really bad state, people. That's the reality. And it's not going to get any better. It's going to get worse. And as long as we're in this increasing situation where, and I'll sum it up because I've only got 1 minute left. How does the MSM get the people's trust back? Well, one of the ways is that we do. The government actually does increase funding for the media, and they present a lot more money funding available for it. And what they do is that funding goes into the media, and it's not with any conditions ascribed whatsoever at all. And instead of actually amalgamating TVNZ and Radio New Zealand, which is what the government currently will, both governments, I mean National Labour, because they basically are working hand in hand with each other. What we do is we actually expand those media presence, and we fund and resource them, and we let them get on, have actual political independence, and we reward and encourage them. That unfortunately never going to happen, because it's not in the interest of the politicians to have a media that they uh, actually call them to account. So probably until at some point where people realise actually how bad it is, and actually get up there and start being a robust citizenryship that calls their own government and their own media to account, the system will not change, and that trust will not return to mainstream media until such time as it does. And so in the meantime, media will become more and more dependent on the largesse of government and the largesse of corporations, who they can rely on to repeat the desired narrative as long as the money keeps coming. And that is where our media is actually heading, and it's what you see every day. You pick up a newspaper, or you turn on the news, or you listen to the radio, is a dumbing down of the media in an industry that is actually awash with, no longer run on principles of journalism, of fair and balance, but in actual fact is based upon propaganda and salesmanship. In a world where journalists themselves are almost extinct. As I said, the figure I gave to you before is now 20 public relations consultants or spin doctors for every actual working journalist in New Zealand. And until that situation changes, no, people won't have trust in you. And I went to Wellington, and what happened in Wellington it could have happened, it happened under the Jacinda Ardern watch, and that'll be her legacy, that the protests, for whatever reasons, at the end did turn violent. It didn't need to turn violent. All she needed to do was actually talk to the people. But the idea that a government is actually accountable to people and actually must come out and talk to them, that's the benchmark that Ardern again set, and what all our governments from now on, whether they're national Labour, will think, oh, this is what they can do, and it'll remain that way until they're called to task by the people, or by we, the people. This has been Vision. These last three issues have actually been my COVID special report, and you're on the Deadline Report with Ben Vision Investigates, Fresh FM. Catch you next week when we'll start to look at the Ukraine.